Welcome back to the Convo Couch, my humans. I am Pasta Jardula.
And I'm Fiorella.
And Jonny Sue is still spinning on the ones and twos. And yes, we're back on the couch. I can't say it enough. I feel so safe, fam, here on the couch from what we just experienced in Portland. It was a little bit of crazy, you know what I'm saying? And everybody talks about, wow, this is imperialism coming home, right? I mean, so with that being said, since we're talking about American imperialism or authoritarian ways on the streets of Portland, which we just witnessed, there's all this talk about China, fam.
China.
And you know me, before anybody else was in big, like, you know, I don't know if we call me an Orientalist or somebody who's China sympathetic or somebody who just says, wait a second, I don't think China is as evil as our American government is telling us. So, to get in those answers, fam, I brought in American enemy number one, Danny Haiphong over here, who wrote a book about American exceptionalism, and he's here to give us some answers. How you doing, Danny?
I'm doing pretty good. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for coming on, and thank you for following us this weekend. It was great going back and forth with you as stuff was going on the grounds, because it's crazy right now, because I think there's an argument out there. It's, America's imperialism or China's authoritarianism. Which one is worse? Right. But I just want to know right off the bat, what is the average life of a Chinese citizen? Because that's what really got my attention. The fact that I heard all these statistics that there were all these people in poverty in China that were now moved up into the middle class, and a lot of them. So what is the average life for a Chinese citizen, and compare it to an American citizenship where it seems like we're moving closer to poverty?
Yeah, no, that's a huge question. I would say that of course, the average life of a Chinese citizen really depends on where you live, depends on which region you are based out of. There has been a lot of work, and I think that over the last 45 years, especially in China, in trying to really bridge the gap between what used to be called town and country in old Marxist terms, but really bridging the gap between the urban and rural areas. That's been a huge focus in China. So right now you have about 5 million or so people in China living below the poverty line in absolute poverty. So if you live in some of these very mountainous regions, mostly in Western China, Southwestern China, your life is very difficult. However, there is an anti-poverty campaign that is really dynamic. When I was in China for 2 weeks, you can see, and I went from east from Beijing all the way to west to Urumqi and Xinjiang, and the anti-poverty program is very dynamic. It's everywhere. It is in the ways in which you walk down the streets, you can see slogans from the campaign everywhere, and you can see the fruits of it, the development, the opportunities. I think in China right now, the average citizen sees their life as having opportunities for education, especially in the realm of higher education. But really the jobs is a huge thing for Chinese citizens right now. It's really about how do you raise the standard of living for the entire country. And most people in China, except for the roughly 5 million who are still living in absolute poverty, see their opportunities as getting better. And even for those 5 million, they're the target for the anti-poverty program to really complete its mission of eradicating absolute poverty, and in moving into the struggle against relative poverty, which not many people talk about when they talk about China's anti-poverty program. There's a lot of misconceptions about it, and a lot of Western press like to try to smear it and say, well, absolute poverty is not a really good measure because it doesn't take into account, let's say, income relative to other countries. It doesn't take into account how a lot of people who have been taken out of absolute poverty still have really difficult lives. Except China understands that, right? Once you give someone the right to housing, once you give someone a bigger income, you develop their region, their cities, then you move into the struggle. Well, how do you then raise their standard of living so they can't fall back into poverty? And so their lives more so mirror the lives of people in China who live in the cities, which is a lot different, and wages are much higher, and there are even more opportunities to really gain real wealth, right? To be able to own multiple homes, to be able to do things like really take care of your family and not have to maybe migrate. So there's all these different issues that China is trying to deal with in terms of its anti-poverty program. But for the average Chinese citizen, life is about how to eradicate poverty and also to just really maintain sort of the gains that have been made over the course of the last 40 plus years and since honestly the revolution. But in China, there is still a lot of understanding that this struggle doesn't really end, especially when you're talking about a global situation that's very unstable. And you're also talking about China not being just a country that is insular, right? It is a global society, and the world is a global world, and the economy is global in character, whether it's capitalist or socialist. So China understands that the struggle to eradicate poverty doesn't even end within its borders. It really has to extend to the broader world situation if they're going to succeed.
So how was China able to move all these people out of poverty? It's something that America is going backwards on. America's creating an ever shrinking middle class and moving people into homelessness and into poverty. How has China managed to do that, especially with the West being the adversary that it is?
Yes, and this is what makes China very unique in a lot of respects because China since 1978 has lifted 800 million people out of absolute poverty. And so that means it has been able to give clean water to 800 million people. It's been able to give the right to shelter to 800 million people. It's been able to give people the right to employment for 800 million people. So at baseline, these measures have been able to lift people out of the most dire conditions. I mean, we're talking about 1978. There was about one telephone per 1,000 people. There was about one car per 1,000 people. Right? There wasn't an infrastructure. So China has focused primarily and principally on developing its infrastructure. And the way that it did this, right, was making a very calculated decision. And this was a decision made by the Communist Party of China at a very crucial period in 1978, where China decided that it was going to open its economy and become friendly with Western countries. And people like to say the United States and China made this deal and try to destroy workers. But really, it was China's ability to open its economy to Japan, to open its economy to Nordic countries, to European countries. That also made up the bulk of its industry and its technical know-how, and that allowed China to absorb some of the knowledge of capitalism and then apply it under socialist conditions. That's exactly what socialism with Chinese characteristics is. It's being able to integrate capitalist mechanisms to develop the infrastructure that you need at a certain point, but ensuring still that the state has principal control over the economy, especially the commanding heights of the economy, energy, key industries, and basically, the things here that are completely private, like the oil sector, like transportation, for example, in many aspects of U.S. Transportation is completely private. So in China, it's completely different, right? You have state-owned industries basically making up the bulk of the largest industries, while private capital is able to operate in other sectors to kind of develop uh, wealth for the society, and then the state then distributes it accordingly. And that's helped really fund this anti-poverty campaign that, especially under Xi Jinping, since 2011, has been such a hallmark of China's overall national policy, where there's been a real concerted campaign by the Communist Party of China to go to the most poverty-stricken regions of the country, and we're talking about a huge country. China is extremely long. I was in the streets of Beijing. It's impossible to walk around in Beijing. They have an amazing transportation system, but um, we're talking about a country where you can go to any region in China and feel like you're in a different country. And so these poverty-stricken regions, mountainous, people are living in areas where there's no arable land. where just farming is nearly impossible. There's been a lot of work to move villagers and people who are living in these very poor villages into more habitable areas. The Communist Party of China and the state have been building uh, entire towns at times to move the poorest people to these regions, give them an opportunity for education, give them healthcare, sometimes for the first time, and really allow them to then build up an industrial base in these new villages and towns. And so that's really how the anti-poverty campaign has worked. And that's basically how it's been done. It's been about looking at the conditions of the whole country, taking global knowledge, economic know-how, technical expertise from other countries in a cooperative way, of course, uh, and then using the mechanisms of the revolution in China, the state system, this very strong communist party in China, 90 million plus people, and using that people power to then generate economic gains for the masses. And that's what makes, contrary to what many people believe, that's what makes the Communist Party of China very popular. And that's what makes the government in China overall, which is not just the Communist Party of China, very popular, is that people do see the progress, regardless of contradictions, regardless of whether there are problems in the society, which just like any other society, there cannot help be but problems. And even so, people see things getting better, and they want that to continue.
Yeah. I think it's really important to point out that you said when China opened up, that's when they were able to grow. And I think a lot of people think that the talk now is, and the reason why I take so much interest in this subject is I don't want another war with China. I don't want to go to war with China. And I can see us looking at China and they're becoming the number one geopolitical enemy and everybody's buying into it. And they use the authoritarianism as an excuse to say, no, they're bad. But I think I want to point out the fact that, and maybe you can reiterate this stuff, that it wasn't China being nefarious. They didn't go into our Congress with lobbyists and get Congress people to vote for their interests just so they can take us over. No, they opened up their economy. They made our goods, and then they held on to our money. And now, since they held on to it for so long, that they're actually the masters of our monetary system because they have so much of it that they were able to buy back a lot of assets for themselves. It wasn't them being nefarious. It was them being opportunistic. And it was our government and our elites who took these jobs out of America and sent them over to China. Is that a good analogy of sorts of how China has really handled this whole situation this whole time?
Yeah, I would say that it is pretty good. And what people need to understand, because as I said, when I was on Jimmy Dore's show, I said this too, is that there's this real strong idea in the United States that's mainly, I think, based in racism, but also based in the economic situation of neoliberalism, where the industrial base has been gutted. And what's happened is that countries like China have been blamed for this. China almost principally, if not at least in the majority sense of the word, has been demonized for free trade deals, etc. But China has, since 1949, arguably, but especially since its reform and opening up period, has negotiated in good faith with other countries around their economic needs and desires. So, right now China is mostly focused in South-South cooperation because the United States is honestly a basket case, both domestically and abroad. But especially in the way that it deals economically with other countries, it just not only does it not have much to offer anymore, it doesn't have that technological know-how or expertise anymore. China has surpassed it in the realm of high tech, the high tech sector. It's surpassed it in so many areas in terms of development. But the United States also doesn't have the desire to negotiate with other countries on equal terms, right? It just wants hegemony. It wants countries to be in debt to international finance, and it wants to be able to call the shots politically as well. And so, even though China always makes the effort to mutually cooperate with the United States because there is a close economic relationship, at the end of the day, when we look at the free trade deals that were negotiated over the course of the several decades, it was the United States, based on an economic impetus of their profiteers and their capitalists, that said the best way to exploit low-wage labor in China was to sell off the industrial base in the United States. That wasn't a decision that China made. But we also have to look at this, I think, historically, right? China had a revolution in 1949. It was a socialist revolution. And from 1949 to 1976, it was diplomatically isolated, economically embargoed, and militarily threatened by the United States. Those are facts. Right now, there's a lot of hostilities in relation to the fact that the United States is sending military weaponry to Taiwan, for example, which is a violation of the One China policy. And it's not often talked about how after the revolution in 1949, the nationalist government led by the Kuomintang, a very right-wing nationalist government that slaughtered peasants and basically betrayed the masses of people in China over and over and over again before 1949. It fled to Taiwan and still has the Kuomintang still has extreme influence in Taiwan. It's a very right-wing party, and basically instituted martial law there that didn't end until the 1980s. And so, oftentimes we're told that China is this like bogeyman, this authoritarian country. It's this country that since 1949 has had a communist stranglehold over its own people, when in fact the United States was backing the former nationalist government in Taiwan, an island that is considered now, especially over the past 30, 40 years, part of China. But it's been supporting that government since the revolution and has been basically trying to diplomatically and militarily isolate China from its own territory through Taiwan. So there is this misconception, I think, when we're talking about how people in the United States think about China, is that it's always, the Communist Party of China is this evil thing and they took our jobs and all this stuff. But it's really a deflection from how the United States has played a central role since it became the imperial hegemon in the world, since 1949, 45, in doing very militarist and just damaging things to China. But honestly, this is a global problem, and it didn't just affect China; it affected the entire East Asian region, and arguably every continent that had to experience what the U.S.'s military and imperialist and economic model was all about.
So just also though, how authoritarian is China in the sense of, we're talking about how we view it here. A lot of people say they have no privacy. They're constantly watched. People are getting arrested for speaking out against the government. And then, of course, we can then dive into the Uyghurs. How dare these people be treated the way they're being treated? Because the way American media paints it is extremely authoritarian. Oh yes, we're not perfect, but look at what China's doing. You're very lucky not to live in China. Is there any merit to these things that are being said?
No, I don't believe there is. Look, China is different. Okay, it is not what I think people in the United States believe to be as quote unquote democracy. And I think, unfortunately, here in the United States, elections are considered democracy, despite the fact we, as you have covered, you guys have covered so amazingly, election fraud happens here all the time. We know corporate bosses own the election system. They own the government. They own the state. In China, it's different. What's interesting in China is that there are local elections. They happen at the local level, the very lowest level of the city prefectures and local governments. But for the most part, how China sees their governance system is a people's democratic dictatorship. And you might think that, wow, democratic and dictatorship in the same kind of framing, that's strange. But for China, what China is, and how the people of China see their society, is they see it as an alliance to create a new country after 1949 between four different classes: between workers, between peasants, between intellectuals, and between the national bourgeoisie, which is considered capitalist. Uh, so the socialist road was built upon that alliance after 1949 because honestly it had to be. There needed to be a national unification against imperialism, and there had to be um, a really strong state system to defend from outside threats and internal threats. So this is often where the United States falls the hardest, is that
Right.
they see when China imprisons so-called dissidents, that China is, taking terrible measures to stamp out democracy. What we usually find out is that these dissidents are trying to overthrow the government and create a system that's more like the United States, more like a European democracy. And, uh, from where I sit in the United States, I say, well, China has the right to develop its own system and to govern in the way that it sees fit, especially when that system has so much legitimacy across the population. And we can also just look at the fact that China's prison population is about 1 million people, which is more, far smaller than the United States in per capita terms. But if we're just looking at the numbers, the United States has more than double of China's prison population. When we talk about, I guess, when we get into the Uyghur situation, there has been a lot of meddling there by the United States, as the gray zone has so covered as such so amazingly. There has been, the National Endowment for Democracy has funded organizations in the United States, Washington, D.C., the World Uyghur Congress, to spread narratives that don't really have any basis in fact. They tend to talk to just a few people, these so-called dissidents who don't really live in live in China anymore. They don't live in Xinjiang. They don't live in Urumqi or anywhere where Uyghurs live in China, and they tend to just recycle the same narratives peddled by people like Adrian Zenz over and over and over again. You really won't find any other sources to around this issue other than Adrian Zenz, and it drives me almost mad. But the reality of the situation is that China does require a pretty stringent system of surveillance because of outside threats and internal threats. That is not perfect, nor is it ideal. People in China don't really like, for example, the Great Firewall, which I talked about in my Black Agenda Report piece a couple of weeks ago. It's not necessarily a popular thing, but people understand why when you have Google basically owned by the CIA, when you have these tech corporations in the West, which are so embedded with intelligence, there is an understanding that if you're going to keep territorial integrity, national sovereignty, that these measures are really necessary. No one talks about how the CIA was stealing data from China's key industries, aviation, oil, the tech sector for 11 years between 2008 and 2019. And it didn't really make headlines, even though basically what happened was a Chinese security firm, Chihu 360, did a review of WikiLeaks documents and then looked more into it and found, wow, we've been hacked for for all this time by the CIA, and they're stealing our information and people's personal information as well, consumer information. And it's all part of this new Cold War, this imperialist war against China, that China does require a pretty stringent defense in order to maintain its national sovereignty. So that's really my position on the authoritarian question, is that, well, there's no doubt going to be problems with the fact that you do have to focus on defense, you do have to focus on surveillance to a certain degree. In China, I would say that the difference between New China since 1949 and the United States is that surveillance really targets, in the United States, it targets leftists, it targets revolutionaries, and it targets the whole population. So there isn't a radical political insurgency here in this country. While in China, surveillance is mostly about protecting national sovereignty and also ensuring that political and social cohesion can occur, and that if there's going to be debate, that it doesn't threaten the revolution. Because just like in Cuba, just like in Vietnam, just like in other countries that have had actual socialist revolutions, um, if the revolution, the integrity of the revolution is compromised, and if there's an ability for certain kinds of ideologies, for example, fascist ideologies, neoliberal ideologies, if those are allowed to grow in the population, then what happens to the revolution? Well, it could be undermined, it could be overthrown. You could have a color revolution. You could have what happened in the Soviet Union, where Radio Free Asia and these kind of CIA-backed media groups are allowed to fester and basically overturn all of the hard work that masses of people, right, ordinary people in China, have put into place to improve their lives. And on that level, I can't help but say, well, it can't be perfect, but it is what it is right now, and it's done a lot of good things for both people in China and the rest of the world.
Well, the NED is all over China. You can't even ignore their footprint over there. But let's stay on the Uyghurs. I was going to talk about some current events. We'll get back to that. Let's stay on the Uyghurs since we talked about it, because I had Carl Zha on the show, and he kind of explained to me the history of that region. I see some people on the chat saying that the Uyghurs had their own country, but then China kind of conquered them and forced socialism on them or communism on them. That was in the threat. But he told me that particular region was one of the how should we call them, the delivery people of the CIA of Uyghurs that went into Afghanistan to give the Mujahideen, who were fighting the Russians at that time, which were the most radical fundamentalists out there, their weapons. And that type of fundamentalism took hold in Western China, in Xinjiang. And that there are separatists within the Uyghur community, but there are also Uyghurs who want to get acclimated into Chinese culture, into the Chinese workforce. And the problem is that they don't speak the language. And to work in China, you need to speak Mandarin, is what Zha told me. So then we look at this whole BBC thing with the Uyghurs a little bit different, where they're showing them not just how to, speak Chinese, but they're showing them other forms of art or other forms of dancing and singing that they might cling on to, rather than the culture that they were raised up in, which was a Operation Mongoose War type mentality. Can you speak a little bit about that there? Is that kind of accurate about how this all started over there?
Well, yeah, look, Xinjiang is a very big province in China, shares many borders with many different countries, including Afghanistan. And its borders were very porous, especially between that period of 1990 to 2016, where there were these so-called extremist fighters coming in, training the most underdeveloped and poor areas of that province, training people, preying upon them, right? This was not some sort of grassroots-led movement, right? What ended up happening was people were armed, indoctrinated into this fundamentalist Wahhabist ideology, and then they were sent across China, not just in Urumqi, but other parts. There was horrific terrorist attacks, even in Beijing. Thousands of people died over that 16-year period, and there was a crackdown in China on this. There was a security crackdown on the people who were committing these crimes, and then there was a social and economic crackdown where that region became one of the principal focuses of the anti-poverty campaign, and the training centers, the boarding schools, as well as the economic jobs training programs there were all meant to reintegrate people who have experienced this very traumatic thing, right? I think that people in the West have a very detached view of what this may be like, but anyone who studied Syria, anyone who has studied the region, Western Asia and China, all the way to the East, you know that these are experiences that are very traumatic for the people, and that they take a very deep and concerted response to undertake. And what's very ironic about all of the Xinjiang stuff in my mind is that, when people say that the Uyghurs had their own country, that's never true. That was never true. The revolution in China has always, since 1949, placed utmost importance on integrating all ethnic minority cultures, 55 of them, inside of the country into a unified um, system. And one of the ways they did that is actually giving priority to ethnic minorities around jobs and education. Not many people understand or know or even care to listen in the United States that the Uyghur population was exempt from the one-child policy since the beginning. That in China, there's hundreds of schools where people can practice their Muslim faith in their education, right? They can actually get it's unheard of here in the United States, right? Right there are dozens of Islamic colleges inside of China. There has been a concerted effort to ensure that ethnic minorities and their cultures are respected, and it's part of national policy. So when I hear things like Uyghurs had their own country, then China's revolution stamped it out, uh, it just flies in the face of the historical reality. Uyghurs were very involved in the revolution in China, and when China was able to integrate Xinjiang, especially in the early to mid 50s in China into the country, um, there was a lot of very positive changes that occurred. It was a very feudal, backward place, similar to Tibet, not too far from Tibet, too. A very feudal, backward region where landlords ran the show. There was just an awful system there. Though I don't remember what the Chinese pronunciation of what Urumqi, the capital, used to be called, but it was translated into something like a land of the barbarous people. So the whole entire people of this uh, now the capital of Xinjiang, Urumqi, were labeled barbarous because that's what landlords thought of them. And Urumqi now means beautiful pastoral land. So there was a huge change, right, in how the entire country saw that region. So eh, when I hear that, China is doing what the United States basically does here in this country and around the world, it makes me, makes my eyebrows raise, but also it just doesn't have much basis in fact. If it did, just like if what was true about Libya or Syria, then those countries would fall pretty easily. And the same could be said about China. If the things that people say about China were true, it likely wouldn't be able to, not only sustain its revolution, but also to grow it like it has, and to make it into something that's even stronger than it was before.
So, two things. What do you say to the people that say this is just another form of brainwashing? Because when they show the BBC piece, they're repeating these songs and they don't get to go out and they don't have too much control. At least that is the Western narrative that we're seeing. And the other thing was, do you think China had to be this centralized type of structure? Because a lot of the things that a lot of leftists in Western the Western world have an issue with China is because it is a very centralized form of government. But ironically, that is what has kind of divided us here on the very tiny left that we have in America. And it just doesn't seem like a country as big as China would have worked out without that sort of overarching defense, not like nationalism, like a defense against the United States.
Yeah, no, very, very good question. I mean, yeah, when it comes to the narrative about Uyghurs being kind of a victim of cultural genocide or what have you, um, I was in Urumqi, which is the capital of Xinjiang and in the Uyghur Autonomous Region, and it, it we talked to people. It didn't feel like their culture was being stamped on. The Turkic language that the Uyghurs speak is everywhere, right? There's no Mandarinization of the country. Really, what you have is a real concerted effort to have people in that region be able to speak both, so they can have jobs and opportunities anywhere, right? So, I mean, I just imagine in the practical sense, if let's say the people of Tibet in the Tibet Autonomous Region or the people in the Uyghur Autonomous Region just spoke their own language and you know, weren't integrated into the entire country. That would leave them vulnerable to predation, to exploitation, and it would leave them just without the same opportunities as other people in China. Here in the United States, we have a huge issue with that, right? With the fact that so much of the country speaks Spanish, yet there's all this racism against immigrants, and there is this exclusion based on citizenship, and all of this that makes it so, you know, certain sectors of the population cannot have the same opportunities as others. So I think China's policy around ethnic minorities, while not perfect, I think does show a commitment to ensuring both unity as well as the preservation of culture. And then the other question about the centralized state, you know, I think I would call China both, right? I would call it both a very centralized state and a very decentralized state, because while a centralized state is very effective around defense, it's very effective around economic planning, a centralized state can't do what China did during the COVID-19 pandemic, for example. It can give broad guidelines, and it can kind of deploy unified measures across the country, but it can't respond quickly. You have to have effective local governance, and you have to have massive public action. And that's what exists in China too. In Wuhan, for example, during the lockdown, you had 400,000 people volunteering to help people survive during a lockdown, to be able to get food, medicine, to be able to teach people. I know a guy who lives in Wuhan, an American, and he said that, you know, volunteers came to his home and helped him use the apps that they needed to use in order to, you know, record their symptoms, and, you know, if any problems, who they could call if they needed anything at all. You know, that kind of public action has to also come from a decentralized state as well, where there is a lot of involvement in organizations, not just the Communist Party of China, but also unions, mass organizations, grassroots organizations. So it's both. And I think anyone you would talk to in China would say that there's both operating at the same time. That's a lot of what I saw, was that you know, you do have a lot of involvement at a grassroots level that honestly is the thing that catches corruption in China, for example, which does happen. It happens mostly at the local level because people are involved and they catch it and it gets addressed. And that's just so different from what we see in the United States. And I would say that both exist, right? You need a centralized state to defend from outside interference, to defend from internal you know, strife and undermining of the revolution, but you also need to have a decentralized apparatus. You have to have channels where people can plug themselves into to be involved in the society, to make it so it feels like it's theirs. And I think that happens a lot. I mean, we saw the 40,000 medics that went to Wuhan as well. All of that couldn't happen without both centralization and decentralization.
Yeah. You know, there's two things that really made me look more into the China whole situation, as far as, like, I have to question, you know, Western media's kind of image of China, because the Yao Weiwei situation, if you remember Yao Weiwei, when he went missing, I was like, well, that's it for that guy. But then about 2 weeks later, they released him and he was back there. He didn't want to talk to everybody, but I know in America, if that guy went missing, he would have never came back ever again. So that made me think, like, why would China do something like that? And then I started thinking, you know, China's imperialism. When's the last time they invaded a country? And you got people out there, we know them. Well, what about Tibet? Like, oh, yeah, that was the 1970s. It's now 2020. It's been like 50 years. I haven't seen China overstep their boundaries imperialistic-wise. And yet all these people, like Kyle G., who just left a super chat on here, and all these other people who I don't know if they've ever been to China, have this opinion that they're so evil. But that's why I wanted to always look into what they're all about. By the way, the super chat contribution from Kyle G. Thank you so much. What does Danny think of Serpensa and Lao Y86? They lived there and left, and explain why. It is very centralized government, according to them.
Hmm. Well, I'm not familiar with what this person is talking about, but there are people who have left China to live in the United States, and who hold a very negative opinion of China. This is the thing that's very important to understand about socialism, is that it is a antithetical to capitalism from the perspective of capitalist-minded people. And
Hmm.
so when the revolution happened, there were a lot of people who did not like it, and most of them happened to be in the landlord class. They happened to have a lot of privileges. They were functionaries in the Gumindang, what have you. They were involved in the old order, and they had a vested interest in the old order. So, and that old order was also very racist and had very negative opinions of mainlanders, kind of like what you see in Hong Kong. So in that sense, right, this happens all the time, right? I get this all the time. Well, what about the Chinese Americans that I know that hate the Chinese government?
Yeah.
And I say, well, this is politics. At the end of the day, there are going to be people who disagree with socialist command style economies that plan and base their societies on human needs rather than just private profit, even though arguably China is the most capitalist integrated socialist country that's ever existed. So uh, in my opinion, that's just par for the course. There are going to be people who dislike it, right? There are a lot of Tibetan. Like, I grew up in Boston, Massachusetts, very close to, and I lived in Cambridge for a while. And there's a Tibetan population there, and they hate China. They think China's the worst, but that's because they come from a Tibetan opposition movement that had very close relationships with the CIA. I even know a person who I believe her father was in the CIA, and worked closely with the Dalai Lama, who was on the CIA's payroll. So there are people who dislike China based on that as well. And at the end of the day, I think it's really about trying to shed these prejudices that have been kind of embedded into us from decades and decades and decades of conditioning that socialism, communism equals bad, capitalism, Western so-called democracy equals good. That's really what this comes down to, and it's politics and it's a struggle. So I don't know exactly what this person is referencing, but I would say that there are dozens of examples like it.
So, in the latest news, Trump has declared the Chinese Houston embassy to be shut down. And so, what is going to be the significance of this move by the U.S. and what sort of retaliation do you think we could expect from Beijing?
Yes. So it's being called an unprecedented move diplomatically. And China has been saying that these are the worst relations with the United States that have existed since 1979. And in many ways, that's true. Of course, it's been an ongoing process, this decline in relations, all the way back to the Obama administration. I think the significance of this move is that it is just another example of the new Cold War that the United States is waging against China. And it represents what I think is going to be the trend for quite some time here in the United States, which is to blame China for its problems and to make these moves in an election period to show that one side of the political aisle is tougher on China than the other. I think that this is a lot of it has to do with the 2020 election, the Trump administration trying to gain leverage on Joe Biden, and doesn't really have any domestic kind of measures that can be put into place to do that. So what it's doing is it's moving on the question of China, which is a geopolitical move as well, where the United States sees China as a great power competitor, and that's the national security strategy right now. And so the Trump administration is moving in this direction based on that doctrine. In terms of China's response, it's unclear, but there is a lot of talk in the media in China as well as the foreign ministry that there will be a response, and it will likely be a similar closure. Some people are rumoring that it could be a closing of a consulate in
Wuhan.
Hong Kong.
Yeah.
Yep, or Wuhan. But it will likely occur along those lines. China just responded to the millions of dollars worth of military weaponry that Lockheed Martin sold to Taiwan by placing sanctions on Lockheed Martin. Unclear what those sanctions are in terms of their relative impact, but I think that we will see this back and forth for quite some time because the United States is very desperate right now. I mean, this is a very unprecedented time for the United States, both geopolitically and in terms of its own domestic situation, where you have a Great Depression, you have an election year, you have a pandemic that's killed hundreds of thousands of people. You just have a political situation, not to mention the movement for Black Lives and movement against police brutality. You just have a political situation that's so unstable in an election year. It's very unprecedented in history that the China bogeyman stuff really serves a critical purpose, and it also makes the military-industrial complex have wet dreams at night to be able to sell weapons to Taiwan. I mean, to Taiwan, to be able to violate the one China policy based on this aggressive ideological stance that the United States is taking in such an egregious manner. Really speaks to just how desperate the United States is to undermine China, but also to just paint China as the enemy of the day now, because there really isn't any enemy, quote unquote enemy, domestically or abroad that can fit the same kind of bill. Russiagate didn't really work. Demonizing the movement for Black Lives really backfired because that's one of the most popular movements right now around the country. So you have this situation where, who is there to blame? And this has been a longstanding problem in the United States, right? The relationship with China dates back all the way to the 19th century, when the United States saw China as its playground for keeping an open market for opium, etc. And so this racism didn't start yesterday. So there's a lot of playing upon that anti-China racism, right? We had the Exclusion Act here. That didn't end. And the United States happened to invade a lot of other East Asian countries like Korea and Vietnam and kind of build upon that anti-Asian, anti-China racism. So that continues, and that's playing a big role in these moves, right? Because it's all about moving the electorate as well as trying to meet geopolitical goals.
Yeah. It's so funny because all the death and destruction we brought to, it's not funny, it's sad, I should say, because we brought all this death and destruction in the 60s and the 70s to countries like Cambodia and Laos, and they're still feeling the effects from the chemical weapons that we dropped on their children. And it's like, we went to the Middle East for a little while, but now it's like, let's get back to this region over here and get back to war with China. And it is just a sad situation. As far as let me stay on the Houston embassy real quick before I get to my next question. Is that going to really affect the businesses? I heard there was a lot of Chinese businesses, own businesses in that area. Is that going to be a deterrent for them if the embassy has to pack up and leave? I mean, who is it going to really affect other than it being symbolic of Trump playing tough with China?
Well, it's unclear. I don't see it as having any real a huge economic impact on China per se. I mean, there is this broader kind of tech war that the United States is playing. Well, the United States has no ability to really compete on the tech side of economic life anymore. So it's like going after TikTok, and it's banned Huawei, all of this. It's unclear. I haven't heard that. What I've heard also is that there are rumors that the move also has to do with the fact that U.S. diplomats don't want to quarantine in China. They are making they're making, just like they've made the virus, the COVID-19, political from the very beginning. They're making the idea that if they were to travel to China, that they would be mandated to quarantine, which is what China would enforce based upon, just basic epidemic and pandemic response measures. So there's rumors about that as well, that's the reason why this happened. So it's unclear about what kind of material effect it will have on China. I think that the overall economic war that the United States has been waging against China has affected the United States way more than it's affected China. Not to say that there aren't impacts and effects, right? It's because the more you try to isolate a country, the more that country has to try to figure out other ways domestically or internationally to make up for it. But like we've seen with China and Iran signing a very multi-layered deal together economically, and as we're seeing just in how China is relating to Russia, for example, China has no shortage of economic partners, right? So I don't know how much it will affect China. The United States, on the other hand, is isolating itself more and more and more economically, politically, and militarily, arguably, and all of that doesn't bode well for the U.S. capitalist economy, because the U.S. capitalist economy does not really have the domestic infrastructure or base will or know-how or ability. Right? I argue that the capitalist system here could not, without eating into profits, really regenerate. So it begs the question who this is going to benefit, other than the political ends that I think the Trump administration, as well as most of the Democratic Party, which is very silent and very supportive of all of these new Cold War measures. I think it really just benefits them and kind of their identity and how they want to be portrayed to a very conservative electorate on both sides of the political aisle here in this country.
Right. They tend to agree on China, I think. What is, like, from an Eastern perspective, what is the significance of Trump's move to take away Hong Kong, their special status?
Well, ironically, it's so Hong Kong, the reason why the capitalist system still exists there's the one country, two systems model, is because China and Britain, when they negotiated the deal, China made a compromise that, okay, international finance can operate there, global capital can be can have much more free reign. You can keep your colonial judicial system, which is very friendly towards financial interests, and that will help us also get access to foreign currency, etc. For have close access to foreign industry. So the ending of Hong Kong's special status really devastates Hong Kong in a lot of ways, right? Because Hong Kong is still a long way from integrating into the mainland economically. But this may facilitate that, because really what you had, which is very ironic, because I think one of the only arguments you can make as to why young people were so, or I guess the only progressive argument you can make why young people were so involved in the so-called pro-democracy movement, was because their declining middle-class status, right? Their declining opportunities that neoliberalism in Hong Kong has kind of decimated for them, was being redirected towards mainland China, because there's been this century-plus long anti-mainland China racism. But this move really shows people in Hong Kong who may still harbor those feelings that actually the United States is the one taking away the opportunities.
Right.
And that the desperate condition that a lot of people in Hong Kong find themselves in, right? Over a quarter of the population is in poverty. Many people living in micro apartments where you have to crawl into, right? So you have these really deplorable conditions there. And this only worsens that, because, until there is more of a capacity, and it'll be a slow process still for China to be able to freely reintegrate Hong Kong into its society with all of this meddling. And I think it's going in the right direction with the national security law. But still, as of right now, this is going to have a really horrific impact, I think, on Hong Kong's economy. And I think it'll have a very, ironically, it will backfire. I think that's really the main crux of this policy. It's hard to see where mainland China, where the central government in China and the economy of China, it really gets hurt more than what we're going to see with foreign capital, as well as Hong Kong itself just be really impacted by this move.
It's kind of funny when I was looking at like a lot of the people, the pro-democracy movement over there, which the NED has had its fingerprints all over, the Hong Kong Human Decency and Freedom Act and whatnot. And it was like they're protesting against Beijing, China. And it kind of reminded me of like when Saudi Arabia attacked us on 9/11. We went into Iraq. And I was like, why are they getting mad at Beijing? This is like austerity laws that were enacted by the British colonial empire that they're still working under. But however, Carl Zoll kind of pointed out that he gave Xi Jinping a B- for the way he handled it, because he felt that if Hong Kong is part of Beijing, is part of China, that Xi Jinping or the Communist Party has to do something to address why those people were so mad in the first place. Now that Hong Kong has rid themselves of all these NGOs, we saw, that this whole taking away their special status was actually a reaction to Hong Kong getting rid of these NGOs, saying we're going to go in there and get rid of these NEDs and all these other NGOs. What is life going to look like in the future for Hong Kong? Can Xi Jinping get this back onto the table where he can somehow suppress this movement of people who are angry? Because a lot of these people seem very racist towards mainland Chinese people. There's an actual cultural complaint, it seems like. How is he going to get this under control, and how is life going to be moving forward in Hong Kong now that we've seen all these bills go back and forth?
Yeah. Well, I think it's going to be a question, really. I don't think there's really a crystal ball we can put on it, because I think that the United States is politicizing the Hong Kong situation to such a degree that I don't see that changing. And so this national security law is a great first step. And sort of what I take from Carl Zah's interpretation and critique is that, for me, from the outside, and from, I think, what many people who may criticize China's policy around Hong Kong is that it didn't do this sooner. But then you have to take into account that there has been this unrest for a long time. There has been this very pro-Western, pro-U.S. influence inside of that city for a very long time. This was attempted in 2003, and it failed badly. There was a massive uproar against it, and it was stopped. So it's unclear because these parties, right, the Nathan Laws of the world, the Joshua Wongs, these organizations, they're not interested in negotiating with China. They're not interested in coming to the table. They're more interested in lobbying in Congress in a blatant signal toward interference in China's affairs. They're more willing to do that because, to be honest, they're on their payroll. So it's not surprising. But at the same time, I think you do have a sort of a popular situation in Hong Kong where, more than half of the country supports the national security law, and more half the city. So you do have an opportunity, if there is some stasis there, some homeostasis there, where China is able to move forward with the decolonization process. But every time China moves forward, you can expect the United States to respond. And so that puts the onus, I think, on people in the United States to stand up and say, the U.S. needs to keep its hands off of Hong Kong, needs to keep its hands off of China, and allow that process to take its own, take its own process into account.
Yeah.
And for China to take care of China's affairs, while the U.S. needs to really deal with its own affairs. And I think the same could be said about the South China Sea. The same could be said about Xinjiang. The same could be said about all of these questions in relation to China, is that there is a basic position here, regardless of what one may think, agree or disagree with me or Carl or anyone else who talks about China positively. I think at baseline, we need to have that position, because I don't think this idea of China being this like authoritarian, all-encompassing evil thing, I don't think that China can on its own be able to deliberate its own affairs if it's constantly going to have to deal with the way that the United States responds. The U.S. is still the imperial hegemon in the world, and that will always be a factor in how China can respond to its own domestic issues and questions like Hong Kong.
It's funny, I made a tweet like that. I said, can you imagine? What would it be like? What would China's reactions be like if American imperialism just took a step back for once in our goddamn lifetime and didn't just push the ball on everything and everything and everything? Hey, man, you talked about some great stuff. Let's talk about this, the No Cold War event that you're putting together. I saw some great names of speakers, Jamu, Margaret Kimberly, Max Blumenthal, Anya Parampel, Kate Hudson, Medea Benjamin. Tell us what's going on with this whole movement, this no Cold War thing, because really this is what it's all about. I don't want a new Cold War with China. I want, I thought that the during the debates, when you talk about the military-industrial complex having a wet dream, when Joe Biden said, I want to move 75% of our forces into the South China Sea, I think the military-industrial complex is like, we can have either Trump or Biden, or we're going to have fun going to war with China. But it's all about stopping the Cold War. It's all about not, escalating these tensions. Now, you have this thing going on. Tell us about this and how it kind of plugs into the American exceptionalism and the geopolitics that follow behind it.
Yeah, sure. So the No Cold War Coalition, you can call us. We're activists, scholars, both based in China as well as the United States and the UK. Carlos Martinez, who's a UK activist and writer, he helped really spur this thing, and I've been working with him and the Chow Collective, John Ross, who's also a speaker and a professor at Renmin University in China. We're all working together to try to put together some programming, events. This is COVID-19 in the United States and the West is really ravaging. So it's tough to do the in-person thing, but we're trying to really make an international committee to oppose these measures, these militarist measures that the U.S. is really putting into place. And I think that opposing the Cold War, we're going to be doing this event 9 a.m. Eastern time, 6 a.m. I think your time out west. And so it's very early on a Saturday, but please do register for the event. But, in terms of American exceptionalism and how it all plays into the new Cold War, right? I think it's this ideology of superiority, and which is mainly a white superiority, but this nationalistic superiority that really undergirds economic, political, military policy in the United States is just really at the crux of how the U.S. justifies all of these measures, right? It's Communist Party of China, China's central government, China's evil. The United States is benevolent. It is democratic. It is in the right, and it has the answers to everything. And so, in an effect, you should support the United States in its conquest against the so-called dictatorship and authoritarian regime in China. So those kind of framings really do speak to this inherent superiority that the U.S. always frames itself in, which is very racist in character. But at the end of the day, it's really about hegemony, and it's about creating these myths that we hold so dear since the very foundations of this country, and to weaponize them, to use them in a manner that can dehumanize others, dehumanize other countries, dehumanize certain sections of the global population as well as the domestic population, to make them targets of war. So it happened with the Native people, it happened with Africans, it's still happening with Black Americans, it's still happening with Native people and documented people, and it's happening in the global South, everywhere, Latin America, Asia, Africa. And China is a big piece of this because China's rising. So China is going to be the number one economic superpower in 10 years. It's going to have a very hegemonic role in world affairs, although it's going to be a different kind of hegemony. It's going to be one that's based on mutual cooperation, multipolarity, the idea that more than one country should dictate world affairs. So that difference between China's view of hegemony and the US's view of hegemony is, I think, really what lays the basis for all of these war maneuvers that we're seeing today.
Yeah. I think that Tom Steyer said it best. No matter what, they have to be our frenemy. We need to sit down and start talking to them. We need to share our global power, and this is what it's all about. Like I said, the reason why I dove into this subject more than anything is I want us to get the knowledge out there. You know what I'm saying? There was a book that was written, Lies My Mother Told Me. You know what I'm saying? About, how the slave trade came and all these lies that were attached to it. It's the same thing with China. We were taught all these lies. And so we need to open up, and we need to, and not to say that China's the best on everything, but we need to know the truth. We need to know the whole story before we make a decision. And I just judge it based upon their lack of imperialism, of going into other countries and trying to take over. Yeah, they had their dirty history. Maybe when it came to Tibet, maybe that situation with the Uyghurs, but their actions as of late, it seemed to be, let's move people out of poverty, and let's kind of spread the Belt and Silk Initiative, the Road Initiative, the Silk Road. They're trying to emulate again right now. So that's why it was important for me to bring you to the table, just so we can get the whole story, Danny. By the way, Greg Allen says, Danny, we got you, and Molly Love, we don't need rulers. Thank you for the super chat. contribution.
And I just want to say, if America would worry more about its domestic issues, and what's going on right now with the pandemic, with the civil unrest, with a terrible economy, then they could even have a leg to stand on when it comes to China. But the fact that they are completely ignoring what's going on in this country and blaming their Eastern counterparts, whether it was Russia for 3 years or it's China now, just shows a lot that they're unable to take accountability and provide. And so I think that if once Americans start seeing what's happening in Portland and the authoritarianism that is there, it just makes us look really hypocritical.
Yeah.
So
and it's even like what somebody put right down here, like and it's so funny because when you were on Jimmy Dore and I saw Jimmy going, man, there's people, they're going crazy in the chat. They're going crazy. This is a subject when you talk about the people, like they can be with you on almost every single issue. When it comes to China, they're like, oh, no, you're wrong. But it says the Belt and Road Initiative is a global warming nightmare. Well, let me tell you something. The worst things for global warming are bombs that we drop left and right and our meat consumption, all that. You know what I'm saying? I'm not saying that China and India, for that matter, can do things in a greener way, but it is not the nightmare that we think of when they're building infrastructure. Do you want to talk about really briefly on the Belt and Road Initiative before we get you out of here? And by the way, Jim Garrison, thank you for the super chat contribution, says, great chat, guys. That's why we brought you on, Danny Haiphong.
Thank you. Well, the Belt and Road Initiative, yes, very, very important. And one thing about it, though, right? China is still economically dealing within a global capitalist system, right? Most of the world deals in capitalism, despite the fact that China, socialist Vietnam, Cuba, but the most of the world's economies, national economies, deal in capitalism. So there is negotiation. It always gets me when China attempts to do something like the Belt and Road and then is criticized for basically operating within a global system. But the Belt and Road Initiative is very important, and I would really push back on the idea that China is some sort of environmental nightmare around the world. China has made incredible progress, especially in the last 10 to 15 years, around pollution and around creating a green economy. They've just built an over 1,000-kilometer hydro electric power system. The majority of vehicles there are electric now. Most cities, if not all cities, have some form of legislation in place banning and or drastically reducing the use of diesel cars. I think what the Belt and Road Initiative should be looked at like is part of China's larger strategy of South-South cooperation. So it's about spreading its model of development, infrastructure development primarily, across the world into Europe. It's really about cooperating with the entire world, but it's about starting in the global South, where conditions are the poorest and where resources are the richest, which China, if it's going to continue to develop itself, it needs access to them. But it's not going to invade. It's not going to plunder. It's going to negotiate with these countries based on a mutual cooperative plan of, we will build infrastructure. We will give you expertise. We will, show you how we've been building bridges and dams and electric grids, etc. Right? And most of the African continent doesn't have there's large sections, nearly 40% of the continent doesn't have access to electricity. And China is saying, well, we'll help you with the electricity as if you can help us with giving us some minerals that we need to produce in our factories. It's a completely different model than the loading countries with debt, creating instability, funding proxy wars, the things that the United States does to global South economies. China's trying to do the opposite, where it's trying to build bridges across the world. And there are going to be contradictions because China is not the only player in this. The Belt and Road Initiative is over 120 countries large now. And the way that those arrangements are met are going to have to reflect both China's political vision, economic vision, as well as the visions of those countries. And it's not, the goal is for win-win cooperation, and it's going to operate under this global capitalist system. I think what people in the United States should be most concerned with is the fact that the U.S. wants no part of this. The U.S. does not want to have win-win cooperation around the world with other countries. It doesn't even want to focus on its own infrastructure crumbling. What it wants to keep countries like Pakistan, it wants to keep countries like Kazakhstan, it wants to keep countries all across Africa in a state of underdevelopment so that those resources can be plundered and expropriated to no benefit for those countries and populations. That's the capitalist model. That's the model of, rapacious neoliberal capitalism the U.S. is trying to export around the world, while China wants to have arrangements based on this Belt and Road Initiative that can build a real trade network across the world into Europe and with the United States if they'll cooperate, in order to bring everybody up. And that will have issues, but at the same time, the overall goal is commendable. And I think it should be looked at, and it should be supported at the very level of, we here in the United States should be demanding that our government deal with countries in that way.
Yeah,
100%.
I think a lot of people don't realize that this Belt and Road Initiative is going to bring a lot of people out of poverty, and people don't look at that and say, wow, look at that. Danny, I can't thank you enough for coming on. I do want you to do me one favor, though. There is an area I think China can really get better on, same with the United States, and that's its animal rights. There are cause for concerns there. So maybe you can pick up the horn, get on with Xi Jinping and tell him, let's push veganism in China the way it's kind of catching on fire here in the United States.
Pasta's been vegan for 5 days, and now he thinks he can just,
but, I mean, the whole process and thought
countries
behind it, I've always been concerned. The area of concern for me is seeing like some of the wet markets in China and the way it goes on. I think animal rights are something that we have to look upon. Not just the United States, but China too. Would you agree on that?
Well, I would say that, I think wet markets generally, the definition of wet market in China is a farmer's market. So it doesn't really involve meat. But what you're talking about is the meat industry in China. There are issues. I would say that it's much smaller in China than it is in the United States in terms of how it's produced, right? It's not as massively industrial produced. Most villagers, most people still eat domestically grown meat. So I would say the problem is not as serious as in the United States, but I would say that there could be. I think that China has been paying more attention to the condition of its wildlife just in general. They're trying to do more preservation efforts. Because during the reform and opening up period, there was a real need to develop the economy. And for many years, in the beginning especially, because international cooperation was still trickling in, there was a need to rely on domestic production, and that did have an effect on the environment. And China's very open about that. I think one thing people have a misconception of is that China understands the consequences of reform and opening up, of integrating capitalism, and how that does create imbalances, right? That's all that's all the central government ever talks about. But you talk to people in China, and balance is it's a cultural question. It's a spiritual question, but it's also a political question of how do you balance these forces? And right now, China is arguably trying to institute its own form of a Green New Deal. It's mostly putting a lot of resources into jobs that will create a more green society. And I think that there's been so much. When I was there, you could just see the progress everywhere. Solar panels everywhere, the streets are very quiet in all cities, right? This is all very integrated and very centralized in the sense that, you see the windmill farms we were on a bullet train, and you see windmill farms for just dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens, hundreds of miles. I think all of that is just a testament to just where China is trying to go. And there's still much work to be done.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Johnny, anything else? Danny, I can't thank you enough for coming on. I want to wish you good luck with your forum on Saturday. And hopefully you'll come on, because I know there's going to be a lot of stuff going on with the Chinese situation. We got Taiwan. That's coming up too now. Now, like you said, Hong Kong was one situation. Taiwan's coming up. The South China Sea, we didn't dive into that. So there's a lot of things that are on the horizon. I want to thank you for coming on. Somebody said pasta, vegan. What? I said, you know what? It's only 5 days, but we'll see how it works out. Danny, will you come back on with us soon?
Yeah, definitely. Just keep in touch.
For sure, man. For Pasta Jardula,
Fiorella.
Jonny Sue on the ones and twos with Danny Haiphong.
Combo out. Bye, guys.